The empty station hummed with an unsettling stillness, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural for a place that should have been bustling with the late-night chaos of a small-town police force. Rookie Officer Ethan Marks sat alone behind the front desk, tapping his fingers against the cold metal edge, wondering why he was the one left behind. They'd called it an emergency, but hadn't given details, just a curt order over the dispatch radio to hold the fort. He had no choice but to obey. The others had filed out in a hurry, barely sparing him a glance as they disappeared into the night, leaving him with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft groan of the building settling around him. Ethan shifted in his chair, glancing up at the ticking clock on the wall. Almost midnight. The hours had crawled by at a snail's pace, his only company the occasional buzz from dispatch, brief and garbled, like words spoken underwater. He flipped through the incident reports from earlier in the evening, anything to keep himself occupied, but his mind wandered to thoughts of what could possibly require every officer in town to leave him alone. Outside, the streets lay empty, darkened by the faint fog that had rolled in after sunset. Ethan found himself staring at the street lamps through the front windows, their pale light casting soft, ghostly halos against the mist. He told himself it was a typical night, that there was nothing to be afraid of. Still, the silence felt oppressive, pressing against his eardrums like a slow, creeping pressure that made him feel strangely vulnerable. He reached for the radio on his belt, adjusting the volume, hoping to pick up any chatter from his fellow officers, but only static greeted him. He frowned, twisting the dial and tapping the side, but the white noise persisted. Maybe they were just out of range, he thought, though the excuse felt thin, even to him. Just as he started to settle back into his chair, a faint transmission crackled over the radio, barely discernible. He leaned forward, straining to make out the words. Unknown individuals, violent attacks, uncontrollable. The words faded in and out, broken by static. He caught only fragments, but they twisted his stomach into a tight knot. There was something in the background, a scream, a panicked shout, then silence. The line went dead, leaving him alone with his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Ethan swallowed hard, his gaze drifting back to the front doors. He tried to shake off the discomfort clawing at him. Just my nerves, he thought, but he couldn't quite convince himself. He pushed himself up from his chair and walked to the CCTV monitor station tucked away in a corner, an old setup that showed grainy black and white images of the station's surroundings. He squinted at the screens, shifting between angles of the street, the parking lot, and the alley that ran alongside the building. The streets were deserted, not a soul in sight, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something unseen lingered just beyond the reach of the camera's gaze. He told himself it was the lateness of the hour, the loneliness of the empty station, but as his eyes scanned each screen, he spotted a flicker of movement at the edge of the parking lot camera. A lone figure shuffled into view, half obscured by the fog. It moved slowly, unsteadily, like it was struggling to keep its balance. Ethan leaned closer, his breath fogging the screen as he squinted to get a better look. The figure stumbled forward, and then another joined it, their shapes blending together as they staggered toward the edge of the station's lot. He recognized the face of the first person, Mr. Parker, who owned the hardware store on Main Street. Ethan had seen him just a week ago, sharing stories with his buddies about his fishing trip. But now, there was something off about him. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and even on the grainy screen, Ethan could make out the dark stains that spattered his clothes. He felt a chill crawl up his spine as more figures emerged, drifting into the parking lot one by one, their movements slow and awkward. Mrs. Hargrove shuffled into view, her usually tidy dress torn and smeared with something dark and wet. She stared ahead with vacant eyes, her mouth slack, and for a moment she swayed on her feet before steadying herself in a jerky, unnatural motion. This has to be some kind of prank, Ethan thought, though the fear gnawing at his stomach told him otherwise. He blinked, leaning back, as if putting distance between himself and the screen might somehow keep him safe. Just then, a heavy, muted thud echoed through the station, reverberating through the quiet like a dull heartbeat. He froze, every muscle tense, straining to listen. Another thud followed, this one louder, and it seemed to come from the direction of the front doors. Ethan's hand hovered over his belt, fingers brushing against the cold metal of his service pistol. He hadn't needed to use it on the job yet, just the occasional call about a drunk or a shoplifter. He drew in a shaky breath and stepped toward the front doors, peering through the narrow window. The sight that met him stole the breath from his lungs. Mr. Parker stood there, face pressed against the glass, his milky eyes staring straight ahead. His forehead left a smear on the glass as he dragged his face slowly downward, his lips twitching in what looked like an attempt to speak, but only releasing a low, guttural groan. Behind him, more figures gathered, pressing closer, filling the steps and spilling into the walkway. Ethan took a step back, the weight of dread pressing against his chest. The door shook as they pushed against it, their hands sliding down the glass, leaving dark smudges behind. He saw fingers bent at unnatural angles, nails missing, skin torn and ragged. One of them, a man with half his cheek missing, exposing a gleaming sliver of jawbone, pressed harder against the door, his hand smearing blood and bits of flesh across the glass. The others followed suit, their bodies pressing forward in silent, eerie unison, the glass beginning to tremble under their weight. Ethan's heart hammered as he backed away, his mind racing. This was no prank. He knew that now, as the reality of what he was seeing seeped into his bones like an icy poison. He forced himself to move, to lock the doors, to grab anything he could find to block the windows, his hands shaking as he dragged chairs and desks toward the entryway. But no matter how much he barricaded, no matter how many times he tried to rationalize, the truth stared back at him through the glass. He was alone, and they were coming. Ethan's hand shook as he fastened the final lock on the back entrance. His makeshift barricade, desks, filing cabinets, anything he could haul over on his own, stood between him and the growing crowd outside. The pounding and scraping echoed through the station, relentless and unnerving, as if every creature outside had locked onto his scent. He checked his pistol for the third time, counting each round. 6 bullets. The small number gnawed at him, a stark reminder that he was ill-prepared for whatever horror was creeping toward him. He glanced around the empty station, swallowing the rising fear as he took in the dim, sterile hallways and the flickering lights that cast long shadows across the floor. It felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. With the front barricades holding, for now, he slipped back to the CCTV monitors. His stomach twisted as he scanned the black and white screens. The horde outside had grown. The parking lot and the front steps were flooded with more faces. Faces he recognized from around town, but twisted and blank. The spark of life extinguished. They pressed against the doors, their hands clawing at the glass, nails scraping with a sound that made his skin crawl. Every face told a story he knew. Mrs. Hargrove, the retired teacher, her eyes vacant, head jerking in stiff mechanical movements. Brian, the young mechanic from down the street, one arm hanging at a grotesque angle, his mouth gaping open as though he were still trying to speak. Each one seemed lost in a trance, as though driven by some primal, ravenous need. A pang of helplessness gnawed at Ethan, but he fought to keep his mind sharp. He'd been trained to face danger, to protect, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this. With a ragged breath, he turned away from the monitors, trying to drown out the relentless pounding at the doors and windows. "Keep it together, Marks." He swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. "You're the only one here, and you've got to hold this place." Yet, as he moved through the hallways, securing doors and windows, the gravity of his isolation closed in. He was truly alone. His fellow officers were out there somewhere, maybe caught up in this nightmare themselves, or worse. The thought that he might never see them again, that he was stranded in a sea of death, tightened around his chest like a vice. The radio crackled again, snapping him back to the present. He scrambled to his feet and clutched it, desperate for some shred of contact, some hint that he wasn't alone in this nightmare. "Outnumbered. Can't hold them back." The transmission came through in broken fragments, each word distorted, muffled by static. A faint scream followed, a sound so raw and terrified that Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. Then silence. He gripped the radio, his knuckles white. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, a final grim acknowledgement of his isolation. Whatever was happening outside had cut him off from the world, leaving him trapped with no way out. He looked at the door, his eyes narrowing as he tried to steady his breathing. Then came the first breach. A shattering crash echoed from down the hall. He whipped around, his heart pounding, and bolted toward the source. Glass littered the floor, glinting under the pale light, and a gaping hole yawned in one of the side windows. Through the jagged opening, a pale, clawed hand reached in, nails torn and bloody, scraping against the sill as it tried to gain purchase. Ethan raised his pistol, aiming with shaking hands, and fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. The hand recoiled, splattering the window with dark, viscous blood that dripped slowly down the glass. The creature outside released a guttural moan, a sound filled with a hollow, unrelenting hunger that set his nerves on edge. He watched, heart hammering as the hand disappeared from view. He took a step back, feeling a momentary flicker of relief. But it was fleeting. The groaning, the scratching, the hungry pounding resumed, louder and more insistent, like the creatures outside had sensed his desperation. Another crash, this time from the direction of the holding cells. Ethan felt a surge of panic as he realized he'd left the rear of the station unguarded in his haste to reinforce the front. He sprinted down the corridor, his boots echoing off the tiled floor, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. As he rounded the corner, he skidded to a halt. One of the windows leading into the cells had shattered, and the twisted form of a corpse, a young man with half his face missing, was wedged halfway through, dragging itself inside with slow, jerky movements. Its eyes locked onto him, cold and unfeeling, as though he were nothing more than a piece of meat. His pulse raced as he backed away, trying to keep his distance, but he was cornered, the narrow hallway leaving him with nowhere to go but back toward the main entrance, where he knew more of them were waiting. The thing crawled forward, inching closer, its mangled face contorting in an eerie mimicry of a smile. Ethan raised his pistol, the cold steel heavy in his hands, and took aim. The bullet tore through its head, a burst of blood and brain matter splattering the floor in a thick, dark spray. The creature slumped, lifeless, its fingers still twitching in grotesque spasms as it lay still. But there was no time to dwell. More were coming. He could hear them, a chorus of low, mournful moans echoing through the station, filling the once safe space with a sense of dread so thick it felt like a living thing. The windows rattled, the doors groaned, and he realized his barricades wouldn't hold much longer. His breath came in shallow, frantic bursts as he pressed his back against the wall, trying to gather his thoughts. He had to make a choice, stay and fight, or retreat deeper into the station. Each option felt as grim as the last. He glanced down at the crimson pool spreading at his feet, the blood thick and pungent, staining the air with the sharp scent of death. He could hear them closing in, their footsteps heavy, dragging across the floor, each step bringing them closer. He forced himself to move, slipping through the shadows, his movements careful and controlled. He knew every inch of the station by heart, but tonight it felt like a twisted, unfamiliar maze, each turn leading him further from safety. He stumbled into the break room, barricading the door behind him with a trembling hand. The silence returned, broken only by the distant, relentless pounding and scraping outside. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the nightmare that had engulfed his world. But the silence was short-lived. The pounding grew louder, more aggressive, echoing through the walls like a heartbeat, reminding him that the dead were still out there, hungry, relentless, and they were coming for him. Ethan sat in the break room, his back pressed against the cold wall, the silence around him a fragile, suffocating thing, broken only by the soft, persistent pounding that echoed through the station. He could feel the walls closing in, each hollow thud a reminder that he was out of time. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to dance and writhe in the corners of the room. He checked his pistol again, though he already knew the count. 3 bullets left. Just 3. He swallowed, fighting the growing dread that churned in his stomach. His breathing was shallow, uneven, and his thoughts spun in frantic circles, darting between escape plans that all felt hopelessly inadequate. Each route led him back to the same grim realization. The undead were everywhere, and they would not stop. A low, guttural moan echoed from somewhere down the hall, chillingly close. He could picture them, their blank, unfeeling eyes scanning the shadows, searching, moving ever closer. The very air felt thick with decay, the sour stench of blood and rot seeping into his skin, marking him as one of the living among the dead. With a determined breath, Ethan forced himself to stand, to keep moving. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to find somewhere to hide, to barricade himself deeper within the building. But he knew that wouldn't save him. They would break through eventually, and when they did, he wanted to be ready. He slipped into the corridor, careful to keep his steps light, moving from shadow to shadow as he scanned the hallway ahead. His gaze darted to the evidence room door, just down the hall, a place he had initially overlooked in his desperate search for safety. He knew there was a shotgun in there, left from a case that had been filed away weeks ago. His last hope lay behind that door. The floor creaked underfoot, and he froze, holding his breath. The moaning grew louder, the slow, dragging footsteps echoing through the hall, drawing closer. He pressed himself against the wall, heart pounding, feeling the weight of his isolation and fear pressing down on him. With a final deep breath, he darted forward, reaching the evidence room door and fumbling with his keyring, his hands slick with sweat. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until he could almost feel the cold, dead presence closing in on him. The lock clicked, and he slipped inside, shutting the door as quietly as he could behind him. The room was pitch black, save for the thin sliver of light that filtered through the cracked glass in the door. He moved quickly, feeling along the shelves, searching by touch for the shotgun he knew was there. His fingers grazed cold metal, and he seized it, pulling it from the shelf with a sense of grim satisfaction. The shotgun felt heavy and solid in his hands, a weapon that, unlike his pistol, could buy him a few precious moments. He checked the chamber. 2 shells, 2 final shots to stand between him and the end. As he took a step back, something outside the door slammed against it, rattling the frame. The sound reverberated through the small room, sending a jolt of adrenaline coursing through him. He tightened his grip on the shotgun, his knuckles white, his breathing quickening as he realized they'd found him. There was no hiding anymore. The door began to splinter, the wood cracking under the relentless weight of the bodies pushing against it. He braced himself, raising the shotgun, his back pressed against the wall as he prepared for the inevitable breach. The door gave way with a deafening crash, and the first body lurched through, its face a mask of rot and decay, its eyes blank and hungry. He pulled the trigger, the shotgun's blast filling the room with a thunderous roar. The creature's head exploded in a spray of dark blood and bone, its body crumpling to the floor in a twisted heap. But there were more. They pushed forward, stumbling over the fallen body, their hands reaching, grasping, clawing. He fired the second shot, another creature dropping in a spray of gore. But even as it fell, more took its place, pressing closer, relentless in their pursuit. Ethan backed away, his mind racing, realizing he was out of ammunition, out of time, with nowhere left to run. He dropped the empty shotgun, the clang of metal against the floor drowned out by the chorus of moans that filled the air, swelling to a fever pitch. In a final act of defiance, he drew his pistol, knowing it held only a single shot. He aimed at the advancing figures, his hands steady, despite the terror surging through him. The dead filled the doorway, their lifeless eyes locked onto him, and he took one last, shuddering breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. As the undead surged forward, Ethan was left standing against the relentless horde, a man facing the inevitable, with a grim, unwavering resolve. Captain Marlowe's hands clenched the wheel, knuckles white against the leather as he steered through the deserted streets. The headlights cut swathes through the creeping fog, casting an eerie glow on the empty storefronts and scattered debris. His mind was racing, piecing together the fragmented reports that had trickled in through dispatch, each more horrifying than the last. Whatever was happening here was no simple riot. Beside him, in the cruiser, Deputy Haynes reloaded his pistol, his face pale, eyes darting from shadow to shadow. In the back seat, Officer Ruiz gripped a makeshift crowbar she'd snatched from a nearby garage before they'd left, her usual calm replaced by a hard-edged focus. Marlo was all too aware of the tension settling over his team like a heavy blanket. He took a quick glance in the rearview mirror, eyes darkening as he thought of the young officer they'd left behind. Rookie Officer Ethan Marks had been tasked with guarding the station. Marlo hadn't been given much choice. They had received an urgent call to respond to a crisis in the heart of town, but no backup was available. Ethan was left alone with limited information, unaware of the true scope of what they were up against. "Captain," Ruiz's voice broke the silence, low but edged with apprehension. "How bad do you think it is?" Marlowe's jaw tightened as he surveyed the road ahead. "Bad enough," he said, the resentment in his voice clear. Most of the department's reserves had been taken by another unit on a call across the county, leaving them armed with a few half-empty magazines and a single shotgun with 3 shells. They turned down a narrow street, and Marlowe slowed the cruiser as something shifted in his peripheral vision. Shadows lurked on the edges of the headlights, wavering figures that seemed to melt into the fog, only to reappear closer each time he looked. Just civilians, he thought, until his gaze settled on the twisted forms emerging from the mist. He recognized the face of old Mr. Benson, the town's retired postman, shuffling forward with vacant eyes, a bloody gash down his cheek that exposed bone. His arms hung limp at his sides, his mouth opening and closing in unnatural movements, as though trying to form words he no longer remembered. "Captain." Haynes's voice was barely a whisper, as more figures stumbled out of the fog, their steps uneven, some dragging broken limbs or trailing intestines across the ground like macabre party streamers. Marlowe's blood ran cold as he recognized the unmistakable emptiness in their eyes. These weren't injured civilians. They were something else entirely. He'd seen enough horror in his years on the force to know death, and death was all that remained in those faces. "Everyone out. Now," Marlowe ordered, his voice a harsh rasp as he threw the cruiser into park and grabbed the shotgun from the dash. They stepped out onto the pavement, each one of them instinctively backing up until they formed a triangle, the cruiser's headlights casting long shadows across the street. Marlowe counted at least a dozen of them, shambling toward them in a slow but determined march, some stumbling over one another in grotesque waves. Is this some kind of disease?" Haynes stammered, his voice tight with panic as he raised his pistol. "Keep it together, deputy." Marlowe leveled the shotgun, his heart pounding. "Aim for the head, and don't waste a shot." The first of the undead lurched forward with a guttural groan, its hands outstretched, fingers shredded and bloody. Marlowe pulled the trigger, and the blast echoed through the street as the creature's head exploded in a spray of dark, oily blood. The body crumpled, but 2 more took its place, indifferent to the carnage. Haynes fired next, his hands shaking as he squeezed off 3 shots, 2 going wide, the third lodging in the shoulder of a decayed woman in a torn floral dress. She staggered, then lurched forward again, unfazed, her mouth slack and dark with blood. "Damn it, Haynes," Marlowe barked, racking the shotgun. "Make every shot count." Ruiz was already moving, her crowbar swinging in wide arcs as she stepped forward, caving in the skull of one of the zombies with a sickening crunch. Blood splattered across her arms and face, but she didn't flinch, her gaze steely as she swung again, cleaving through the jaw of another that had managed to close the distance. But for everyone they took down, more seemed to emerge from the darkness, a ceaseless wave of bodies that closed in on them, step by dragging step. "Captain, we're getting boxed in." Haynes' voice was rising, panic breaking through as he emptied his last clip, only to see his bullets barely slow the advancing horde. Marlowe cursed under his breath, knowing their chances were dwindling with each passing second. The shotgun was down to 1 shell, and his sidearm only held 6 rounds. Desperation clawed at his thoughts as he scanned their surroundings, searching for any way out. There, he pointed to a narrow alleyway just ahead. barely wide enough to fit them, but a temporary escape route nonetheless. "Fall back. Move." They dashed down the alley, Marlo in the lead, Ruiz close behind, and Haynes bringing up the rear. The undead shuffled after them, their relentless groans echoing off the brick walls, filling the tight space with a cacophony of dread. They emerged from the alley into an open lot, a hardware store looming across the street, its windows dark and empty. Without a word, Marlo motioned for them to follow, and they barreled through the glass doors, quickly dragging shelves and tables to barricade the entrance. Inside, the silence was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing and the faint scrape of fingernails against the windows as the undead gathered outside, their vacant eyes fixed on the dim glow inside. Marlo took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan. They were low on ammunition, their weapons were practically useless against the sheer number of infected, and they had no backup coming. He thought of Ethan, alone at the station, probably hearing snippets of chaos over the radio without knowing what was really happening. "Kid, you have no idea how lucky you are to be behind locked doors right now," he thought grimly. Ruiz broke the silence, her voice low. "Captain, what the hell are we dealing with?" Marlo shook his head, the words heavy on his tongue. "I don't know. But whatever it is, it's spreading. Fast." He glanced at the radio on his belt, wondering if any of his officers were left to respond. The thought hung between them, dark and unspoken, that they were on their own, surrounded, and the town they'd once protected was now their greatest enemy. As they fortified their barricades, the groaning outside grew louder, more insistent, the bodies piling up against the glass. The air inside grew thick with fear, a palpable reminder that they were trapped, and every second brought them closer to the inevitable. With a final glance at his officers, Marlo gripped his shotgun, feeling the weight of its single shell. "We're not getting out of here by waiting. We need to keep moving." Haynes met his gaze, his face pale but resolute. "Then let's make every damn shot count." The captain nodded, steeling himself. Outside, the horde waited, silent and hungry, the night thick with the promise of death. The flickering emergency lights cast eerie, wavering shadows across the walls of the hardware store as Captain Marlowe, Deputy Haynes, and Officer Ruiz stood in the center aisle, their backs to each other. The sound of groaning and relentless pounding on the glass front of the store filled the air, an unceasing reminder of the nightmare waiting just outside. "Anything we can use?" Marlowe asked, his voice low but edged with urgency. "Nothing worth much," Ruiz replied, holding up a hammer and a rusted old hatchet. She hefted the hatchet, testing its weight with a grimace. Not exactly ideal. Haynes held up a shovel and an old hunting knife, his face pale, his hands trembling. "We're screwed, aren't we?" Marlowe shot him a hard look. "Get your head on straight, deputy. Panicking isn't going to get us out of here alive." He paused, listening to the unrelenting scrape of fingernails against glass, the faint guttural moans that filtered through the walls. "We need to keep moving. If we stay here, they'll break through eventually, and we'll be sitting ducks." As if in response, the glass shattered. A bloodied arm reached through, groping blindly, its flesh raw and torn. Another body slammed against the window, followed by another and another, each one adding weight, each one forcing their way through the growing fractures. Marlowe's heart hammered as he shouldered the shotgun, aiming it at the window. "When they get through, stay low and head for the alley," he ordered, voice steady, despite the fear gnawing at him. With a deafening crash, the glass gave way, and the horde spilled into the store, a wave of rotting flesh and empty, hungry eyes. Marlo fired, the shotgun's blast tearing through the first wave of bodies, sending bits of flesh and bone flying. The force staggered the front ranks, but the rest surged forward, undeterred. "Go!" Marlo barked, swinging the shotgun like a club as they broke for the alley. Ruiz led the way, swinging the hatchet to clear a path, the blade sinking into skulls and necks with sickening crunches. Haynes followed, wielding the shovel, his face twisted in horror as he brought it down on anything that moved. The smell was overwhelming, blood, rot, and decay, mingling in the confined space. Marlo could feel it coating his skin, seeping into his pores as they fought their way through, the undead pressing in on all sides, relentless in their pursuit. They burst into the alley, stumbling over bodies, their clothes smeared with blood and viscera. Marlo's stomach churned, but he forced himself to keep moving, his focus on survival, on putting as much distance between them and the horde as possible. They rounded a corner, only to come face to face with another group of infected. These ones were fresher, their wounds still raw, their bodies less decomposed. Some were children, their small frames twisted and unnatural, faces blank and slack. A young boy with a broken leg hobbled forward, mouth open in a silent scream, his teeth bared, blood-stained fingers reaching out. Ruiz hesitated, her grip on the hatchet faltering. "Oh, God. They're just kids." "They're not kids anymore," Marlo said, voice cold. He grabbed her arm, forcing her to keep moving as the undead closed in around them. He could feel the hot breath of one of them on his neck, could hear the snap of its teeth as it lunged, and he barely ducked in time, swinging the shotgun butt into its skull, the bone cracking under the impact. Haynes screamed as a zombie grabbed his arm, its teeth sinking into his wrist. He swung the shovel wildly, breaking free, but the damage was done. Blood streamed down his hand, dark and glistening, as he staggered back, panic flashing in his eyes. "I'm bitten," he yelled, voice cracking with terror. Marlo's gaze hardened and he looked Haynes square in the eye. "Then make your last minutes count." Haynes nodded, swallowing hard, a flicker of determination settling over his face as he gripped the shovel, bracing himself for the swarm that was descending upon them. They backed into a narrow, dead-end street, their backs against a graffiti-stained wall, the undead closing in on all sides. Ruiz swung her hatchet with wild abandon, the blade biting into flesh and bone, spraying blood across the walls, while Marlo used the last shell in the shotgun, blasting through a line of bodies and buying them a few precious seconds. Haynes fought with desperation, swinging the shovel with everything he had, every blow taking down one of the infected, but leaving him more exhausted, more blood-soaked. His bitten arm hung limp at his side, the blood loss taking its toll, his movements growing sluggish. "Captain, we're not getting out of here." Ruiz's voice was barely audible over the din of the horde, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with the realization of their fate. Marlo looked around, searching for any way out, any escape route, but all he saw were blank, hungry eyes and rotting hands clawing toward them. He felt a cold, heavy acceptance settle over him. They were out of options, out of time. "Then we go down fighting," he said, his voice steady, defiant. He pulled his sidearm, each shot methodical, each one finding its mark, but the horde just kept coming, an unstoppable tide of death. Haynes let out a strangled yell as he was pulled down, the undead swarming over him, tearing into him with frenzied hunger. His screams echoed off the alley walls, mingling with the guttural moans of the undead, a horrifying symphony of death. Marlo fired until his clip was empty, the slide clicking uselessly as he backed against the wall. He looked over at Ruiz, her face streaked with blood, her eyes wild with fear. "Stay close," he said, his voice low, filled with grim determination. He grabbed a broken pipe lying nearby, his last weapon in this fight. The undead pressed closer, their faces twisted, jaws snapping, hands outstretched. Marlo swung the pipe with everything he had, his mind a blur of rage and desperation, his only thought to protect Ruiz, to buy her just a few more seconds of life. But he knew, deep down, that it was a losing battle. Marlo's breaths came in ragged gasps, the alley around him swarming with shadows and sickly gray hands clawing through the darkness. The pipe in his hand was slick with blood and fragments of bone, and every swing was met with a nauseating crunch. Yet the undead kept coming. He and Ruiz stood back to back, the alley's brick walls pressing in on them, trapping them with the relentless horde. Ruiz's hatchet rose and fell, each swing taking down another of the relentless attackers. She was panting heavily, her strength waning, but her gaze remained steely, her movements fueled by sheer survival instinct. "Captain, how many are left?" she asked, her voice a strained whisper, as she decapitated another creature, blood spraying across her face. "Too many," Marlo replied grimly, shoving a corpse back with the pipe, feeling it give way under the pressure. He stole a quick glance around them. The alleyway was quickly becoming choked with bodies, limbs sprawled, faces frozen in twisted, grotesque expressions of hunger. The few small windows lining the walls were too high and barred, and there was no way up, not that it mattered with the horde pressing in from both sides. The radio on his belt crackled with static, and for a brief moment, hope flickered in his chest. But it was short-lived. There was no voice, no backup, only the cold hiss of dead air. The feeling of isolation wrapped around him like a shroud, and he understood that any help was far beyond reach. This was it. He and Ruiz were alone. The dead were closing in, the scent of decay overpowering. Their fingers scraped against the bricks, leaving bloody smears as they pushed closer, their faces hollow and hungry. Marlo felt a strange calm wash over him, a cold clarity that sharpened his senses. There was no way out of this, not for both of them. He glanced over his shoulder at Ruiz. She was barely holding on, her eyes darting between the advancing undead and him, as if waiting for a command that would change the impossible odds before them. "Ruiz," he said, his voice low but steady. "You need to get out of here." She blinked, momentarily stunned by the words, before the reality of their situation sank in. "Captain, we're both..." "There's no way. Listen to me," he growled, catching her gaze. "They haven't completely boxed us in. If you break through that last line, you can make it. Head back to the station. Find Ethan. Maybe he made it, maybe he didn't. But you find that kid if you can. You hear me?" Ruiz's face twisted with desperation, but she nodded, her jaw clenched. She gripped the hatchet tighter, her resolve hardening as she prepared herself. "I'll come back for you, Captain. I swear." Marlo allowed himself a small, sad smile. He knew she wouldn't be coming back, and deep down, he suspected she did too. But he gave her a final nod, a wordless promise that he'd hold the line as long as he could. With a fierce battle cry, Ruiz lunged forward, her hatchet swinging in wide arcs, cutting down the undead, blocking her escape. Marlo followed, taking down the creatures nearest to her. using his body as a shield to give her a chance to push through. She hacked her way down the alley, disappearing into the shadows as the zombies turned their attention back to Marlo. He backed into the far wall, gripping the pipe with both hands, readying himself for the onslaught. The dead flooded toward him, their lifeless eyes fixed on the lone figure, standing defiantly against the brick. His mind emptied, his vision narrowing until all he saw were their faces, grotesque, slack, and hollow, each one an accusation of the nightmare he'd been helpless to stop. The first of the horde lunged, and Marlo swung the pipe with a force that splintered bone, sending the creature sprawling. Another took its place, jaws snapping, hands clawing. He slammed the pipe into its temple, feeling the sickening crunch reverberate up his arm as it crumpled. But for each one he took down, another filled the gap, a ceaseless tide of bodies pressing closer, hemming him in. Sweat mixed with blood as his muscles screamed in protest, each swing slower, each breath harder to catch. The alley reeked of decay, a choking miasma that stung his eyes and burned his lungs, but he kept fighting, his determination defying the odds stacked against him. The pipe slipped from his fingers, slick with gore, and he staggered, reaching for his sidearm with a shaking hand. He fired, the shots precise, each one finding a target, but his ammo was running low, and he knew he had only seconds left. The last bullet chambered with a grim click, and he raised the gun, pressing it to the forehead of an advancing corpse, pulling the trigger in one final act of defiance. The zombie collapsed, but the others kept coming, their hands clawing, teeth snapping. Marlo's back hit the wall, his body exhausted, his movements slowing as the undead closed in. He could feel their icy fingers gripping his arms, their teeth grazing his skin, but he kept fighting, kept resisting, refusing to go quietly. As they overwhelmed him, Marlo's last thought was of Ruiz, her determined face, as she pushed her way free. "Run, kid. Run as far as you can." The dead swallowed him, their bodies piling up, and the alley fell silent, save for the sound of the undead feasting. The streets were quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet that used to settle over the town late at night. This was the silence of death, of things waiting just out of sight. My boots squelched in a puddle of something thick and sticky, and I didn't have the courage to look down and see what it was. The air reeked of rot, sour and wet, sticking in the back of my throat no matter how much I tried to breathe through my mouth. I kept moving, one step at a time, hatchet gripped tight in my hand. The blood on the blade had dried into black smears, and the handle was slick with sweat. My other hand held the radio, useless so far except for the occasional static that teased me into thinking I wasn't alone. I hadn't heard a human voice since I'd left Marlo behind. Captain Marlowe. I could still see his face, the grim determination in his eyes as he pushed me forward and turned back into the swarm. His last words to me echoed in my ears. "Find Ethan. Keep moving. Don't stop." My breath caught as I rounded the corner, catching sight of a pile of bodies slumped against the wall of the hardware store we'd raided for supplies. The corpses were bloated, their faces slack and discolored, but their arms were stretched toward the street, like they died reaching for something, or someone. I felt the bile rise in my throat and forced myself to keep going. "I'm not stopping, Captain. Not until I find him." The faint glimmer of moonlight revealed an abandoned restaurant up ahead, its windows cracked but not fully shattered. I didn't want to stop, but I needed a moment to figure out my next move, and I wasn't going to last long without water. My throat burned, dry and raw, as I shoved open the door with my shoulder, hatchet raised and ready. The place was eerily still. Tables were overturned, chairs scattered, but there were no signs of movement. My footsteps echoed softly as I moved deeper inside, the stench of spoiled food and decay thickening with every step. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, catching a faded menu board and splatters of something dark on the linoleum floor. A faint sound reached my ears, a shuffle, almost too quiet to hear. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, every muscle in my body coiled tight. The sound came again, from below, the basement. No. Don't. You're not that desperate. But I was. I needed supplies, and if there was anything down there worth taking, I couldn't afford to leave it behind. Gritting my teeth, I moved toward the stairwell, the door hanging ajar. The stench hit me like a wall as I descended, each step creaking under my weight. My flashlight flickered, the beam casting long, jumping shadows across the walls. The basement was a storage area, shelves lined with cans and crates. My stomach tightened at the sight of intact water bottles stacked against the far wall, the labels crinkled but legible. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching on shattered glass. Then the groan came. It was low and guttural, coming from the far corner of the room. My flashlight swung toward the sound, illuminating a figure crouched behind a stack of crates. Its head snapped up, eyes dull and cloudy, lips pulled back over blood-stained teeth. The sound seemed to wake the others. I hadn't seen them at first, but now I could make out the shapes shifting in the shadows, their bodies stiff and jerking as they turned toward me. Shit! I backed up, my heart slamming against my ribs as the first one lunged. The hatchet came up on instinct, the blade sinking into its skull with a wet crunch. I yanked it free as the second one came at me, its arms flailing, mouth snapping. I swung again, the blade slicing through flesh and bone, but they kept coming. The shelves rattled as I shoved past them, knocking over cans and crates in my scramble to reach the stairs. A hand caught my arm, the grip impossibly strong, nails digging into my skin. I twisted, the hatchet catching the thing in the neck, but the momentum threw me off balance, sending me crashing into a stack of crates. The noise was deafening, metal and glass clattering to the floor as the swarm closed in. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my hand and rolling across the floor. The beam flickered, illuminating flashes of teeth and empty eyes as I groped blindly for the stairs. My foot caught on the edge of a step, and I scrambled upward, swinging the hatchet wildly at anything that moved. The shaft, the ventilation shaft near the ceiling. I'd seen it on my way down. My mind raced as I climbed the stairs, reaching for the small opening just above the landing. It was a tight fit, but I wasn't about to stick around to see how long I'd last if I didn't try. I pulled myself into the shaft, my arms burning with effort, and kicked at the grates until they gave way. The groans grew louder behind me, echoing through the narrow space as I crawled forward, the air thick and stale. My hatchet clanged against the metal walls with every movement, the sound grating and relentless. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of moonlight filtering through a broken vent. I pushed the vent open, collapsing onto the pavement outside. My chest heaved, my entire body trembling as I lay there, staring up at the dark sky. The radio on my belt crackled. "Anyone? This is Ethan Marks. The station is..." I froze, my hand flying to the radio. The signal was weak, but it was him. It was Ethan. Ethan! My voice cracked as I spoke, desperate and breathless. "This is Ruiz. I'm coming to get you. Hold on." The static swallowed his response, but I didn't care. I had a direction now, a purpose. I wasn't stopping. Not until I saved him. The closer I got to the police station, the worse the town looked. The streets were littered with overturned cars, broken glass, and bodies. Lots of bodies. Some were fresh, others bloated and split open like overripe fruit, the stench of decay rising in waves. The only sound was the occasional groan or shuffle from the undead lurking in the shadows. They were everywhere now, more of them than I could count. I moved carefully, sticking close to the buildings, ducking behind trash bins and abandoned vehicles. The hatchet was steady in my grip, but my hands were slick with sweat, the handle threatening to slip every time I clenched it tighter. Every step felt like walking on eggshells, my breathing shallow as I scanned every corner, every shadow for movement. It wasn't long before they spotted me. I had just rounded the corner of an alley when I saw them, half a dozen stumbling toward me. One of them let out a garbled snarl, its face half gone, jaw hanging loosely as it dragged itself forward on shattered legs. The others followed, moving faster than I expected, their movements jerky and erratic. "Shit," I hissed under my breath, backing up until my shoulders hit the brick wall behind me. The alley was too narrow to maneuver, too tight to run. There was no choice but to fight. The first one lunged, and I brought the hatchet down hard, the blade sinking into its forehead with a sickening crunch. I wrenched it free just in time to swing at the second, the edge catching it in the neck. Blood sprayed, hot and thick, as the creature crumpled, but the others were already on me. I kicked one in the chest, sending it sprawling, but another grabbed my arm, its fingers digging into my skin. I swung the hatchet blindly, the blade catching on bone as I pulled free. My heart pounded as I fought, each swing slower than the last, my arms screaming in protest. The last one came at me, its mouth snapping inches from my face, and I shoved it back with a growl, slamming it into the wall. The hatchet came down again and again until it stopped moving. I stood there for a moment, chest heaving, the alley now silent except for the ragged sound of my breathing. Blood dripped from the blade in my hand, pooling at my feet. I couldn't stay here. They'd heard the fight, and more would come. They always did. The next few blocks were a blur of shadows and blood. I moved quickly, using every ounce of strength and skill to stay ahead of the swarms. I ducked into a school at one point, hoping to catch my breath and find a safe path forward. But it was a mistake. The building was dark, the hallways silent except for the faint creak of settling wood and the muffled groans that seemed to come from everywhere at once. My flashlight cut through the gloom, the beam flickering as I moved, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Lockers lined the halls, some still open, their contents spilled onto the floor. A child's backpack lay abandoned near the door, one strap torn, a smear of blood across its front. My stomach turned as I stepped over it, the sound of my boots echoing unnaturally loud. I should have turned back right then, but I didn't. I kept moving, drawn deeper into the maze of hallways until I reached the gymnasium. The doors swung open with a groan, revealing a scene that made my blood run cold. The room was filled with them, dozens of them. They were scattered across the gym floor, some slumped against the walls, others standing motionless in the center of the room. Their heads turned in unison as the door creaked open, their dead eyes locking onto me. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then they moved. I ran, my boots pounding against the floor as they swarmed after me. The hallways echoed with their groans, the sound growing louder as more joined the chase. I turned corner after corner, heart hammering, lungs burning, until I hit a dead end. Panic clawed at my chest as I turned to face them, the hatchet heavy in my grip. They were close now, their faces pale and slack, mouths gaping as they reached for me. The first one lunged, and I swung with all my strength, the blade biting deep into its skull. Another came, and I slammed it into the lockers, the metal denting under the impact. Blood sprayed, the air thick with the smell of death, but they just kept coming. I backed into a classroom, shoving desks and chairs against the door in a frantic attempt to buy myself a few seconds. The barricade shook as they slammed against it, their groans filling the room. My eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help, and landed on a fire extinguisher mounted near the window. Grabbing it, I turned to the glass and swung, the extinguisher shattering the pane in a burst of shards. The cool night air rushed in, and I scrambled onto the ledge, the extinguisher still in my hands. The zombies burst through the barricade just as I jumped, their snarls following me as I hit the ground below. I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the station's block. My legs felt like lead, every muscle in my body screaming, but I didn't care. I was close. The radio crackled to life again, Ethan's voice faint but clear enough to make out. "Station. Can't. Hold." My grip on the radio tightened, my heart pounding. "Ethan, I'm here. I'm coming. Hold on." I looked up at the dark outline of the station in the distance, the faint glow of light in the windows. I was so close, but I could hear them already. The groans, the scrape of nails on glass, the relentless pounding of fists against barricades. The station was a fortress, but it wouldn't hold forever, and neither would Ethan. The police station loomed ahead, a bastion of flickering lights and shattered glass. I crouched behind a burned-out sedan, my heart pounding as I scanned the building. The undead had swarmed the front entrance, their bodies pressed against the barricaded doors. Fists and decaying arms pounded the glass in a relentless rhythm, a sound that carried over the deathly stillness of the streets. I adjusted my grip on the hatchet, my hands slick with sweat and dried blood. Ethan was in there, alone, likely counting his last bullets as the horde closed in. I had no idea how he'd held out this long, but I wasn't about to let him die tonight. The odds weren't in my favor. The undead outnumbered me tenfold, and the streets offered little in the way of cover. But I had one thing working for me. Their hunger made them stupid. They'd go where the noise was, and I had every intention of giving them something loud to chase. I pulled the flare from my belt, a lucky find in the school gym, and struck it. The red light flared to life, hissing as it burned. I hurled it toward a cluster of wrecked cars down the block. The flare bounced against the hood of a truck, landing with a bright, sputtering glow. The undead reacted immediately. Their heads snapped toward the sound, and the mass shifted, their movements slow but deliberate as they shambled toward the light. Not all of them took the bait, but enough did to thin the crowd at the station's entrance. I didn't wait for them to fully disperse. I bolted. I reached the side entrance, breathless but determined, my ears tuned to every sound. The door was cracked open, held in place by a bloodied chair wedged against the frame. I shoved it aside, slipping inside, and quietly closed the door behind me. The smell hit me first, blood, sweat, and the sickly sweet stench of rot. The dim emergency lights cast eerie shadows along the walls, and the faint hum of the generator echoed through the empty halls. I could hear the pounding of fists and glass from the front of the station, growing louder as the Horde tried to force its way inside. I moved quickly, keeping low as I navigated the narrow corridors. Blood streaked the walls, and spent bullet casings littered the floor. Signs of Ethan's desperate fight were everywhere, but the man himself was nowhere in sight. "Ethan," I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's Ruiz. Where are you?" Nothing. Just the pounding and the low, guttural moans of the undead outside. I tightened my grip on the hatchet and pushed deeper into the station, my every step echoing through the empty halls. The evidence room was at the end of the corridor. The door was ajar, and faint light spilled out onto the blood-stained tiles. My stomach twisted as I approached, the sound of muffled groans growing louder. I could hear Ethan's voice now, faint but unmistakable. "Come on," he muttered, his tone steady despite the chaos. "Come on, you bastards." I stepped inside, and the scene froze me in place. Ethan stood at the far end of the room, his back to me, his pistol raised. The undead filled the doorway, their lifeless eyes fixed on him as they surged forward. He held the gun steady, his hand trembling only slightly, but I could see the resignation in his posture. "Ethan!" I yelled. He whipped around, his face pale and streaked with blood. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Ruiz, what the hell?" "No time!" I cut him off, rushing to his side. "You're not doing this alone." The Horde pressed closer, their hands clawing at the doorway, their snarls filling the room. Ethan's pistol clicked as he fired his last round, the bullet tearing through the nearest creature's skull. It crumpled, but the rest kept coming, their bodies piling into the room. "Get to the generator," I shouted, shoving him toward the corner of the room where the controls glowed faintly. "We can trap them in here." Ethan hesitated, but only for a second. He bolted for the generator, his boots slipping on the blood-slick floor. I swung the hatchet, the blade sinking into the neck of the closest zombie. The momentum wrenched it from my hands, leaving me with only my fists. "Move faster," I yelled, grabbing a chair and smashing it against the next one that came through. Splinters flew as the creature stumbled back, only for another to take its place. "I've got it," Ethan yelled. The generator hummed louder as the evidence room's reinforced doors began to slide shut. I backed up, grabbing the hatchet and pulling it free, just as the last gap closed. The undead slammed against the glass, their snarls muffled but no less horrifying as they clawed at the barriers. Ethan and I collapsed against the far wall, the silence almost deafening after the chaos. My chest heaved, my arms shaking as I looked over at him. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with relief and something close to gratitude. "Thought I was done for," he said, his voice hoarse. "You would have been," I replied, managing a weak smile. "Good thing I showed up." We made our way back to the break room, the only part of the station that still felt remotely safe. I turned on the small TV mounted in the corner, hoping to catch a weather report or anything that might help us plan our next move. Instead, we got the news. The broadcast was grainy, the signal cutting in and out, but the message was clear. The anchor looked exhausted, her hair disheveled, her voice steady but strained. Behind her, a map of the world lit up with red zones, each one larger than the last. "This is a global emergency," she said. "The outbreak has spread to every continent. Major cities have fallen, and governments are struggling to maintain control. Citizens are advised to shelter in place and conserve resources. Trust no one." The screen cut to footage of London, its streets choked with bodies and smoke. Paris was burning, the Eiffel Tower silhouetted against the flames. In New York, helicopters circled Manhattan as hordes of the undead surged across the bridges. Ethan stared at the screen, his face ashen. It's everywhere. I nodded, my throat tight. But we're still here. He looked at me, his expression hardening. What now? I gripped the hatchet tighter, my resolve solidifying. We fight until we can't anymore. The broadcast continued, but we turned away, our focus now on what lay ahead.